Welcome to the Big Four Accounting Firms podcast, brought to you by big4accountingfirms.com and the Big Four Accounting Firms YouTube channel. Before we get started, just wanted to remind everybody to support us if you have a chance or if you can. Even $1 helps, and we have a link in the description to a website called Buy Me a Coffee. It's just a way to donate to us and support us. Again, any amount is helpful so that we can keep putting out content. And there's also other ways for you to support us in the show notes to this podcast or on YouTube in the description. In today's podcast, we're going to discuss news out of KPMG. And it's because KPMG is facing a record fine in the UK. And it seems like you would think that would be a crazy amount of money, but it's not. It's 15 million pounds or about $21 million. And the news about this came out on Monday, yesterday. And this is related to when they advised a bed maker called Silent Night. And they advised on the sale of Silent Night to a U.S. private equity company. And this is related to work from 2011. And the fine is related to grave misconduct. Reportedly, it had a conflict of interest with HIG Capital, and they lost their objectivity, and they dishonestly advanced or associated themselves with misleading statements. And it allowed the company to shed pension liabilities. And so this resulted in a $15 million fine 10 years after the fact to KPMG. And KPMG, and it was assessed by the FRC in UK at the advisement of a tribunal. And I mean, it's kind of besides the point now. It's 10 years down the road, and it's only $15 million. But KPMG tried to say that this is related to a restructuring arm, which they no longer hold. So I guess if they get rid of a piece of their business, then they shouldn't be held to a fine. And I think it's a little bit ridiculous that it takes 10 years to get to this point. And I don't think this is really that punitive of a fine. I mean, it's going to affect the partners today. So the partners that were initially advising on this probably no longer work for the firm or are retired. And so I'm not sure who this is meant to penalize other than the current day partners and the current day staff of KPMG in the UK. I think the FRC needs to act quicker, or they need to, I'm not exactly sure what they could do for things like this. I think the big four have to be a little bit more careful on who they advise, but they're always going to take a risk when the penalties are like this, because if you're a partner today and you know nobody's going to come after you except for 10 years, then what's the downside of taking on a client if you need to meet your revenue goals this year? And that's what I say frequently, is that the big four accounting firms are very short-term sighted, and they're not so focused on ethics, because if you're focused on meeting revenue goals this year to make your bonus this year, then why do you care about a potential fine that will be assessed at the country level 10 years from now? It's not really going to impact you. If, however, you were personally fined or barred from ever being an accountant again, then maybe that would have some implications. It's tough to say what can prevent this. I don't think you can perfectly prevent this. We've spoken about this before on this podcast. I think people at their individual level need to think long term, and that's what I encourage people to do versus thinking short term and not seeing conflicts of interest, not onboarding clients particularly well. I think that's another thing that the big four accounting firms have to do, but I think they're going to continue to run into things like this even though they get rid of restructuring arms. I don't think that's going to perfectly prevent things like this from happening. But we already know that the UK is going to continue to intensely regulate the big four accounting firms. They already have. They forced them to split up their restructuring arms as conflicts of interest and fraud cases like this continue to arise. It's only going to increase in the UK. And then I think the UK is going to set the standard for what's going to happen here in the US. And I think that's why you see things like we saw with PwC and their trust solutions. They're hoping by branding themselves as a trust organization, they're going to avoid further regulation, but I don't see how that's going to happen. And PwC themselves, in doing that trust solutions designation yesterday that we spoke about, is trying to avoid regulation like this because they put all of their accounting entities, or they're trying to put them in one bucket, and they're trying to put their consulting in another bucket to avoid conflicts of interest and also to avoid further regulation for when bad things do happen. Will that occur? I don't think so, because these are some of the largest organizations in the world. They're going to face regulation and lawsuits no matter what, because when somebody's left holding the bag, they're going to go after large organizations that were involved in as we know, the big four accounting firms are involved in almost every large organization around the world. So this will continue to happen. As companies fail, then they're going to blame the big four accounting firms, and they're going to ask for increased regulation. So I only see this continuing to happen. We know this happens in the UK. We cover it here all the time. The fines keep getting bigger and bigger, but not by that much. By a couple of million every year they increase. We went from 10 million to 12 million to now 15 million. Who knows when, how much they'll grow. But also, you have the big four accounting firms in the UK saying that you can't over-regulate them, because then there's no accounting firm with enough specialization to take over if they collapse. But then you have mid-tier accounting firms saying that they can do the work. So it's going to be an ongoing battle. It's been going on for over 20 years, even more than that. But as the big four accounting firms have moved in, the big four accounting firms, they continue to face regulation. They continue to say that they can't collapse because they're the only companies that can provide this work. But we'll have to continue to see how this pans out. In the UK, the big four accounting firms do not have an easy go of things. And we just have to keep seeing how this regulation goes, and whether these firms will get broken up in the UK, which they partially are getting broken up because of restructuring. But we'll continue to keep an eye on the increased regulation in Europe. So that's the podcast for today. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast to get future updates, and support us financially through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes if you can. And if you can't, thanks for listening.